Okay guys, this is the last video I'm going to make. Let's start out talking about the speaker in the poem. Who is speaking? Who is speaking? Who is the poet? It's easy to say just the poet. However, many poets often write what are known as persona poems, which means it's from the point of view of another person, sometimes an object. A famous poem of Sylvia Plath's is called Mirror, and it's a persona poem that is from the point of view of a mirror. So it's not always the speaker. It's not always the poet, I mean, so it could be a character. Furthermore, if it is the poet, like I was talking about with my poem that I wrote, it represents the poet at a very particular time and place, in a very particular frame of mind, and they're trying to present themselves in a certain way that, you know, may not actually be how they are. Even if poems are autobiographical, it doesn't actually necessarily mean the speaker is exactly who the poet is, if that makes sense. Almost like a role they're playing in that poem. However, yeah, so it's better to ask, how do you imagine the speaker is? What kind of lifestyle do you think he leads? What are his his personality characteristics? You know, character traits. To ask who is speaking. Who is this? If it's a man writing the poem, who is this man? If it's a woman, who is this woman? Don't just say it's the poet, but more like, what are they like, right? And what sense of them do you get from the poem? And yes, and obviously if it's from the point of view of someone who's completely different than the poet, it's a persona poem, which means they're playing the role of a character even more actively. Okay, tone and mood. What is the tone of the speaker? Is it lighthearted? Is it teasing? Is it grim? Is it wistful, melancholy? And then what mood does it provoke? And if you remember from fiction, tone and mood are different. Tone is the intention of the author, and mood is how the audience receives it, which can sometimes be different. Sometimes, you know, it has provokes an unintentional response. Or that the author didn't intend. Okay, register. Register is the same as when you're teaching language. It means formal or informal language. Does it sound like a friend talking to you, or conversational? Or, for example, on the Amtrak to Boston, I think it's called, by Sherman Alexie, that poem, it's a narrative poem about meeting that woman. It's talking about all the history, and he's thinking about, you know, lady, you don't know anything about Native American history, but she's an elder, so he's very kind to her. That wasn't in the poems you were supposed to be reading. That sounded like someone talking to you, telling a story, right? Very conversational and informal. Or does it sound more like heightened language with rich vocabulary that is out of the ordinary, or sounds more formal? Is there a mix? Sometimes there's a mix, and if so, why and to what effect? Why is it mixed? What effect is the poet trying to produce? Okay, audience. Who is the audience? Other poets, kids, white people, men, women. Who is it aimed at and who is it for? These could be different, right? Think about the one that we did, the 7 pool players at the Golden Shovel. Gwendolyn Brooks, We Real Cool. That seemed to be aimed particularly at kids, almost like a PSA, right? Public service announcement, don't drop out of school, kids. But it was also aimed at others in the Harlem Renaissance who were romanticizing the darker aspects of that, of bootlegging during Prohibition. Like Marge Piercy's Barbie doll was aimed at men, trying to understand women's experience with being this kind of objectification and focus on looks, but also at women, like, hey, women, does this ring a bell for you? Do you empathize with this? Or does it speak to you, right? So who's the audience? Imagery, sensory language, visual descriptions, auditory descriptions, taste, touch, smells, figurative language, simile, and metaphor, which we just talked about in that other screencast, using like or comparison using like or as, comparison without like or as, symbolism, is it a recurring symbol, and if so, what is it symbolic of, just like in fiction. So let's talk about this poem. It's called Lying in a Hammock at Williams Duffy's Farm in Pine Island, Minnesota by James Wright. Over my head, I see the bronze butterfly. Alliteration, right? This is consonants, consonant sounds. Asleep on the black trunk, blowing like a leaf in green shadow. Down the ravine behind the empty house, the cowbells follow one another into the distances of the afternoon. To my right, in a field of sunlight between two pines, the droppings of last year's horses blaze up into golden stones. Here you have an echo and an off-rhyme, pines and stones. I lean back as the evening darkens and comes on. A chicken hawk floats over, looking for home. I have wasted my life. Okay, so people are often shocked by this last line, like, well, this poem was so relaxing, and what? But let's talk about it for a minute. First of all, let's look at the imagery here. Black trunk, hard C sounds, hard sounds, and black here. The imagery, is kind of symbolic. Green shadow, ravine is like a gulf, right? A big hole, empty hole. Then we have empty house, distances, right? Empty and distances have a kind of go together. Something that is far away, no longer here. In a field of sunlight between two pines, the droppings of last year's horses, right? So this place has been abandoned, blazed up into golden stones. This is a metaphor, right? No like or as. They appear to be blazing up like golden stones in the sunlight. They're golden because they're so dried, because this farm has been abandoned. I lean back as the evening darkens and comes on. So leaning back, like lying down rather than going forward. Evening is darkening, end of the day. Chicken hawk, this is a predatory bird. And also the bird, what's he doing? He may be floating, which is peaceful, but in another example of literary irony and contrast, he's looking for home, right? He's also sort of been abandoned or is homeless or wandering. So you see a lot of this imagery that it seems so relaxing until you really start to look at the poem. I have wasted my life. Now, what you think that last line means really depends on who you think is lying in a hammock at William Duffy's farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. Very specific. Is it the poet? Or, and we can talk a bit about his life on, should be in that PowerPoint about the authors actually, or maybe not. But we can talk about it in any case on Tuesday. Is it the poet, or is it a persona that he's putting on? Now, the poet often, he wrote about the life of working class people, especially in the rural Midwest, farm workers, field hands, and he wrote about their disenfranchisement as those jobs began to be automated, and they lost, a lot of work was lost, and whole towns became kind of bereft, and high unemployment rates because of losing these jobs. And this was like, in the 80s that he was writing about this. This has continued to get sort of worse since then. So you get the feeling that he's, wherever this is, it's been abandoned. Last year's horses, he's either guessing or he was there last year. The house is empty. The cows are far away. Horses are gone. Evening's coming. Chicken hawk, a predatory bird, is looking for home, and he's just alone. Okay, now you could think, if this is a drifter, let's say it's a persona poem being written from the point of view of an out-of-work, unemployed drifter who has lost his job working on the farm because it's no longer in existence. Maybe he's just drifting around and from farm to farm, or he's come back to the place he used to work, but it's gone, and he's lying in the hammock. And he's wasted his life because he's never been able to find good work or do something good with it. On the other hand, is it about the poet? The poet moved to the big city. I think it was to New York. I'd have to double check. But in any case, he moved to the big city. He lived in the life of the literati around other writers. An urban lifestyle. He wasn't around what he thought of as his people, which is Midwestern working class people. In that case, maybe he's saying that he has wasted his life by being in the city, by not being out here in the country. Maybe he's wasted his life by, this is all passed him by and it's gone. He could have been there last year when all the horses were there and his friend was there and everything was busy and bustling, and it could be a metaphor for how these jobs have been lost and there's no longer any, it's hard to make a living on the land anymore. If it's the poet, he could be saying he's wasted his life by not being where his heart belongs, in the heartland, right? But if it's a drifter, perhaps he has wasted his life by drifting away around from farm to farm and never settling down, and never being able to do much with his life, put anything together, any savings, a family, if this is some homeless drifter. So who is the speaker in this poem really matters to the meaning, right? I'm not going to tell you because I actually don't know the answer. Maybe he's someone else. Maybe neither of those is right, but you can see what a difference this makes. So this seems to be like a snapshot of what he's seeing and smelling and hearing. He's hearing the cowbells. He sees the bronze butterfly blowing like a leaf in green shadow. He sees the droppings blazing up, which means like shining in the sun like golden stones. He leans back. He sees a chicken hawk floating over. So it's sounds and sights, right? And you can see how there's a lot of irony in the juxtaposition of like all the relaxing stuff, like asleep, black trunk, blowing like a leaf, green shadow. Cowbells follow one another, sounds really nice, but into the distances of the afternoon is kind of sad. Field of sunlight is really nice and beautiful, but it's the droppings of last year's horses again, the little echoes of sadness. You've got droppings, you've got horses that are gone, and only their droppings that they've left behind are left. But the unexpected beauty in that, right, as the sun is setting, sun setting meaning like end of a life, end of a day. Evening darkens and comes on, he leans back as if accepting it. Even the chicken hawk is looking for home, not for his dinner. So there's like both these things, but lean back is also very relaxing, right? So you have all this contrast of things that seem relaxing while lying in a hammock, listening to the cowbells, listening to the butterfly asleep. And then you have contrast with this dark of black and shadow and the emptiness of the ravine and the house and the distances and the nostalgia of last year's and the strange sort of like predatory chicken hawk here. It's not a dove or a pigeon, but even this chicken hawk is looking for home, which is also interesting contrast. And then suddenly I have wasted my life. This doesn't seem to come out of nowhere, if you noticed all this going on at first in the poem. So again, and then what is this? This seems like very conversational, mixed with a little bit of formality, right? And who is the audience? The audience could be fellow poets, could be working class people, his people from the Midwest where he came from, farmers, vagabonds, you know, people who like to read travel journals, people, and, you know, all sorts of people could be his audience here. I think this is arguable. Sometimes the audience is clear. Here it's not necessarily clear. I mean, sometimes it's easy to see the audience. Yes, the speaker is really open for interpretation here. Who is William Duffy? Why is he at his abandoned farm, lying in the hammock? Why is he both relaxed and so wistful or melancholy that this is the unexpected twist ending, right? Surprise ending. And yet, looking back at it, doesn't seem all that sort of surprising. And then symbolism of light and shadow, distances and emptiness. That's symbolism that repeats throughout. And the chicken hawk is also a symbol, right? So these are symbols in the poem. Shadow and the black trunk, those are symbols, empty house. Yes, so I want you to think about all of these And then the metaphor, blazing up into golden stones. Think about all these things when you're reading a poem.